Okay, this is something that I've been planning to do for quite a while. I've been doing a little bit of research as well as just putting in my own thoughts. And yeah, I figured this would be a really fun project for me, and I hope you enjoy it. So, this is a brief ish history of progressive rock looking throughout the decades. I want to talk about the bands and artists that either help shape or revolutionize the progressive rock landscape. I want to talk about the different waves of different subgenres that have emerged within progressive rock. And I think that this is going to be a fun little reflection of where we came, because I'm a history buff. I love history. And this is one of the things that I love to do. And I kind of want to tackle this as like a living history. So many of us have lived through different periods of this. And so it's kind of good to just kind of take a step back and see like where we came from, what has come before to help shape the genre that I love so much. So I want to do a little bit of housekeeping before we dive into this maiden voyage of this little series, because I think there's going to be, 7 episodes in total. So I hope you enjoy. So first bit of housekeeping before we dive into it. This is just me. I am coming to this with my own experience as a lover of progressive rock. So there will definitely be holes in this. I won't be able to cover everything. Much like a perfect map is useless because it's essentially a one-to-one, a perfect summary of progressive rock would be useless because I'd have to go way, way back to wherever. So this is just my own interpretation of, what has come before. Because of that, there will be genres and subgenres of progressive rock that I will not be talking about, just because I do not have that foundational knowledge in order to speak upon. I could do years and years of research about it to get myself up to that level, but I wanted this to be a fun little exercise. I didn't want this to be work. I wanted this to be fun. And I will most likely be getting a few things wrong. Nobody is perfect. Just correct those in the comment section. Be polite about it. I don't need to have somebody being in there being like, my God, this individual has no idea what he's talking about. The astounding audacity of this individual. He needs to be murdered at once. Like, no, man. Take a seat. We're all human. We all make mistakes. If I say something that's, incorrect or whatnot, just let me know in the comments. It's share and share alike. That's what this is all about. This is meant to be fun. This is meant for people to be like, ooh, yes, I know those bands. And, oh, I love the connections that they're, putting together. That's what this whole thing's being about. Okay. That all being said, we've got each episode will be kind of subjugated. Yeah, see, we're already making mistakes. Will be subdivided into different parts and, kind of looking at the different facets individually and how those facets have influenced and, engaged with the progressive rock movement as a whole. So we're going to start with part 1, the introduction. What is progressive rock? It's always good to define your terms before we even get started, because I could just start talking and I will lose people. So I want to define some terms right off the get-go, and let's talk about what is progressive rock, what is prog. It is a style of music that came out in the late 60s, early 70s, that I believe came out specifically within the UK, that took a bunch of different genres together, blended them, and here we are. It concentrates on longer stretches of music, complex rhythm styles, kind of is shrugging off the preconceived notion of how songs should be constructed. So in that sense, it's a lot of different pieces that were already existing in the musical landscape that were then kind of put together in a perfect puzzle. And, as I mentioned, got started in the very late 60s and went until about the mid to late 70s, depending on who you ask. The heyday, the perfect time was usually from about 1969 to about 1975-ish. And then after that, we get into what I'll be covering later on. So that is some definitive terms. And then progressive rock as we know it either has one of these two qualities, and this is what I always label for progressive rock or prog in any of its iterations. Part 1 is that the song itself progresses, and that is what we had from the 70s. So The song could be, 30 minutes long. It could be 10 minutes long. It could be 5 minutes long. It could be 3 minutes long. As long as it's progressing in some way, shape, or form. There's an unconventional rhythm style or a structure to the song. It doesn't just follow the verse, chorus, bridge, chorus kind of makeup. There's something strange going on within it. That's part one. Part two is that it moves the music forward. If it's not progressing as a track, it's progressing then in a macro. If it's not progressing in a micro, it's progressing in a macro. So it's moving the music forward. It's doing different things. It's trying different styles. It's literally progressing the musical landscape. So those are my two ideologies within progressive rock. So yeah. Now let's get into Part 2, influences from the before times. In the beginning, there was nothing. Then, one day, a lonely creature, very similar to what humans look like, banged things together, either rocks, stones, twigs, sticks, and began to harmonize or vocalize in some way, shape, or form. Thus began the first music. Okay, I'm not going to go that far back. But I do love, I studied a little bit of linguistics, back in my university days. And I can't remember if it was Piaget or Vygotsky. That was basically like the advent and invention of human language was done in tandem with the invention and discovery of music. You couldn't have one without the other. And in fact, our language, our speaking ability is musical. When I'm speaking, my voice is going up and down. It's not just monotone all the time like a computer would be. It's moving. And I remember there was this study where if you took a sentence and you clipped like maybe 3 to 5 seconds of that sentence and just played that little snippet on repeat over and over again, you would actually begin to hear the music within the sentence. You would hear the music within the words. And then when you put that that little snippet back in the sentence, when you got to that sentence, you would hear the music, and you could never divorce the music from that area. When you got to that sentence, you would hear the music, and you could never divorce the music from that area. Hear the music, 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 hear the music. When you got to that sentence, you would hear the music, and you could never divorce the music from that area. Yeah, it's brilliant and it's beautiful, and it is that whole language is music. Anyway, that's a little bit of a tangent. Coming into here and talking about the history of progressive rock, you really have to go right back to the beginning, and, we're basically talking about Western music. Unfortunately, I can't talk about the Eastern music, and we can't talk about any of that kind of stuff, or like, the Southern music, the African music, the Asian music, because like that is so rich and it's so individual and like different than what we have over in the Western music that I almost want to do a whole other stint just based on that stuff, because man, it's fascinating. But if we're talking about the Western music, we got to talk about our boys Vivaldi, we got to talk about our boys Mozart, and let's talk about Beethoven and Bach a little bit. But like, if you think about progressive rock, Vivaldi was a progressive rock artist. His Four Seasons, one of his most famous pieces, could be called a prog album. It is a concept record. There are 4 movements within the album, and within each of those movements, we have individual tracks. And so not only do you have this concept record about the Four Seasons, but it's structured like a prog album. And it's for that reason that prog artists would eventually grab that idea and plunk it down on here. If we're talking about Mozart, Mozart really revolutionized different musical expressions. If you wanted to have a shredder on topic, nobody was better at shredding on the piano than you had on Mozart. And later on within Liszt, Liszt. Ludwig, whatever his name was, they made a movie out of him. Lutzomania. It was great. Roger Daltrey was on it, and Rick Wakeman helped write the score. Anyway, we're going to have a lot of those really fun, tangents on here. But again, those individuals began to really shred on the piano. It's like, why play 2 or 3 notes when 12 notes will do? You know, he was reconstructing tracks and movements that other people had arranged and just began to fill it with different notes to create something that was complex, that was challenging. And then we got Beethoven and Bach that really added on atmosphere and added on emotion into that. Like, Beethoven is one of my all-time favorites because of his symphonies. You know, the Sixth Symphony of Pastoral is, again, another concept record that showcases these pastoral like views and, you know, the coming in of the, you know, the different movements on there, the rises and ebbs and flows within this larger stretch of music. Same within Bach, within his use of the organ work, you know, and really mastering a single instrument in that case. So yeah, that produced the foundation. That was planting of certain seeds that would then be carried over into, say, the 19th and 20th century with other classical composers. You know, you've got Stravinsky and Tchaikovsky. I mean, who else is more prog than Stravinsky when it comes to challenging the audience? Their whole Rite of Spring movement created a riot. And that, like, I can't think of anything more prog than that. You know, and if you go and listen to the Rite of Spring, or you listen to the Firebird, or if you listen to any other Stravinsky movements or, you know, compositions, you can hear the foundation of progressive rock. So much of later masters would use that as a starting point. While that is all being done, that's some of the seeds that were being planted. Another seed that was being planted at this time was the jazz music from America. We're looking at Miles Davis. We're looking at Herbie Hancock. We're looking at Chick Corea. You know, we're looking at John Coltrane. Those individuals that were fusing different styles and different expressions into this expression of just pure creativity. You know, that's where you get the jazz. That's where you get improvisation of the moment. You know, you might have a route that you are following, but once that route is in place, you can just go. And the creative approach to that, you know, especially within the 60s, you know, that jazz movement within the 60s was so rich and so dense of creativity that it was a wonder that more people didn't pick that up and try that in different musical styles. You know, these were really not only taking the seeds that came before, but harvesting and then making something completely new. So now we have a kind of a theoretical, philosophical mindset to be placed onto music. You know, it's that free range, anything goes, don't be afraid to experiment. Because up until that point, music was so rigid, you know, music was just so constrained that this style of freedom was just so revolutionary. Because on the backbone, you had the rock and roll of the day. You had the Elvis individuals coming out. You had the Little Richie. You had, you know, this energy, this blending of R&B and country that created something completely new within the rock scene. This is where we get that traditional rock and roll. And then blended within that, you had the British invasion. You know, so all of this kind of led into a spear point. And when we start to actually see the blooming of progressive rock, this is where we're entering into the 60s. And I feel like if all of that was the foundational planting the seeds, watering the seeds, and letting things grow, then the actual beginning harvest, the beginning flowering, does come to artists like the Beatles, like the Beach Boys, like the Yardbirds, like the Who, the Doors, Procol Harum, Moody Blues, Iron Butterfly, Frank Zappa, you know, all of these individuals that were taking that styles and beginning to infuse it with that jazz experimentation. You know, you can almost draw that very clear line from one to one. So with albums like Pet Sounds, like albums like Sgt. Pepper and Revolver, you're really starting to see the beginning styles of progressive rock in that sense. You know, they're starting to just unshackle themselves from the constraints of the music that came before because it was so rigid. And I always say that, like, up until this point, the evolution of music was much more in the survival of the fittest, like what people want to listen to. So it would either be a sink or a swim. You know, an album would come out and something would work, and then they would try, you know, that in a different expression somewhere else. So it was like very incremental, very slow moving. And then eventually progressive rock came out, and instead of it being an incremental survival of the fittest, we got a mutation. And that is where we start to get actual prog proper albums, or at least proto albums. That's where we get bands like Pink Floyd, Jethro Tull, Uriah Heep, Deep Purple, Black Sabbath. And we're starting to see a little bit of a splintering here. So I think I wanted to do this incrementally, but I guess I didn't. So part 2 was the influences within the 4 times I already talked about. Part 3 was the rock became more experimental. So that's where we were talking about the Beatles, the Yardbirds, the Who, the Doors, Procol Harum, Moody Blues, Iron Butterfly, Frank Zappa, and David Bowie. Now we're coming into part 4 with bands who would go straight into prog, but they needed to do some groundwork first. So that's where you have Pink Floyd, you have Jethro Tull, a little bit of the Genesis, you know, you have a little bit of Yes. And so albums had come out prior to the 1970s, but you wouldn't necessarily put the label of prog on those records, you know? Same with the birth of metal within Uriah Heep, Deep Purple, and Black Sabbath. Those artists and bands were writing music in the late 60s where metal wasn't even a thing at that point. So we're getting like proto-metal. You know, I still believe one of the first metal albums out there was the first Black Sabbath, but if you listen to Black Sabbath, it's a lot more like blues. You know, it's almost a blues record than it is a metal record. All of this kind of came to a head with my part 5, which is where we're going to end this particular video off with the real birth of progressive rock. The first album, in my opinion, that was full-on prog. All of these other albums were getting the engines revving. You know, this was like, we're waiting for the lights to turn. Everything was being put into place. Everybody was doing their own little thing to add something to the pot, to add something to the dish. And then we got King Crimson's In the Court of the Crimson King in 1969. And this was the true birth of progressive rock. This is where all those elements, all those foundational materials fruited in its proper form. And we got our first fruit, the forbidden knowledge of what progressive rock actually was. And In the Court of the Crimson King was that turning point. This is where we stopped being psychedelic rock. This is where we stopped being symphonic rock. This is when we stopped being acid rock. This was when we started being progressive prog rock. And it changed the landscape. Like, I can still draw that line right there. Because after In the Court of the Crimson King, even though all these artists were already working on their prog albums, that's when the floodgates opened. And that's where the true first wave of progressive rock started. And it really took root in the 1970s. So the next video I'm going to be talking about episode 2, prog's explosion and implosion within the 70s. From there, we're going to go into episode 3, into the 80s. Episode 4 is going to be tackling the 90s. Episode 5 is going to be within the 2000s. Episode 6 is the 2010s. And then episode 7 is going to be in the current landscape here in the 2020s and what progressive rock looks like now. So I hope you guys will join me for that. I'm expecting each episode to take about 20 minutes. And look at that. We're practically at 20 minutes now. And I hope you'll join me for this because I love talking about this. I love talking about the different facets, the different divisions, you know, where one band took things and ran with it, and what progressive rock looked like in each of these decades. So I hope you'll join me along for that. I hope you have a good time for that. And yeah, I think that's where I'm going to leave it for today. So I want to thank all of you so much for watching this maiden voyage, this pilot episode of a brief-ish history of progressive rock. I hope you guys found it as entertaining as I did doing it, because I had a blast thinking about it and preparing for this, and honestly, I had a great time recording it. So we're going to see if I have a good time editing it. That's the key. So yes, thank you all so much for watching. You guys are definitely the best. And until next time, notes out.